Fall Asleep to entire history of the Spanish Civil War, full documentary. Sometimes, before the world turns upside down, there is a strange quiet that no one notices. Roads are empty in a way that feels ordinary. Letters arrive on time. Bakers still open their shops. Children still walk to school. But something in the air has already begun to change, and though no one speaks of it, people carry this knowledge beneath their clothes like small stones hidden in their pockets. Tonight, we are here together to tell a story not of heroes or villains, not of victories or losses, but of people, ordinary people, people like us, people who woke up believing in peace and went to sleep beneath the shadow of war. Before we begin this story, let us pause for a moment to remember why we share it. We tell this not to stir anger, not to glorify violence, but because we truly love and care for you. We believe that in knowing these things, your heart may rest a little softer in the world. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Spain, in the years before 1936, was a country that felt unfinished. Its cities held monuments to past empires, but its streets were cracked with hunger. Its people read newspapers filled with poetry and anger, and beneath every conversation was a silence too big to name. A silence made of centuries, a silence sown from kings and revolutions and fields soaked in too much blood. In Madrid, in Seville, in Barcelona, in the small villages stitched between mountains and coasts, life seemed normal. A little harder than it had been before, but still stitched together by habit. People married, people buried their dead, priests still offered blessings, but there were whispers even then. Whispers about neighbors, about land, about loyalty, about how long one could remain untouched by the world beyond Spain's borders. At night, the radios played soft music from Paris and Berlin. No one could hear the boots yet. No one could see the smoke. But something beneath the earth had already begun to tremble. In the countryside, farmers woke early and prayed for rain. Their hands were cracked from labor. Their faces lined with years of waiting for change that never seemed to come. Spain's soil was rich in places, dry in others. Its people argued about the land as if arguing could change the harvest. Some believed the Republic had betrayed them. Some believed the church had betrayed them. Some believed that no one, in the end, would ever come to save them. In small towns, old men gathered beneath olive trees and told stories of wars they had survived. They remembered generals with medals, kings with soft hands, revolutions that ate their own children. And as they spoke, young men listened with their arms crossed, their jaws clenched, already imagining what kind of men they would need to become. In every story there was a lesson. Loyalty is dangerous. Power forgets. History does not forgive. Meanwhile, in Madrid, the government changed faces as often as a house changes curtains. Ministers came and went. Laws were written and torn apart. The streets filled with protests that burned out by nightfall. Workers demanded bread, students demanded books, soldiers demanded orders, and somewhere above them all, politicians smiled as if the world was still within their control. Spain was learning how quickly promises turn to dust, how easily a friend becomes an enemy, how a neighbor's laughter can harden into suspicion. In these quiet years before the storm, there were still weddings, there were still baptisms, there were still mothers folding sheets in sunlit rooms. But beneath the surface, Spain was unraveling. Piece by piece, thread by thread. Those who could afford it left. They packed trunks and said soft goodbyes and promised to return when things became calm again. Those who stayed learned to live with uncertainty. They learned to watch what they said, to lower their voices, to listen for footsteps. In the bars, people still raised glasses. In the churches, people still knelt in prayer. But faith itself was beginning to fray. Spain was tired. Tired of kings, tired of promises. tired of waiting for a future that never seemed to arrive. In villages, people remembered famines. They remembered winters without bread. They remembered what it meant when the army marched through streets not meant for guns. These memories lived beneath the skin, unspoken but not forgotten. Memory is a quiet soldier. It waits. It endures. It chooses its hour. As the months turned, as the papers filled with speeches and accusations, people began to disappear. Not in great numbers, not yet, but slowly. A teacher here, a priest there, a man who had said too much at the wrong table, a boy who had carried the wrong flag in the wrong square. Fear moved softly, like smoke beneath doors. In Madrid, the cafes grew quieter. In Barcelona, the factories hung banners with words no one trusted. In Seville, old songs played from radios that could no longer drown out the silence in people's hearts. Beneath all this, beneath the flags and speeches and crowds, Spain itself seemed to wait. The land was older than any government, older than any war. It would outlive this too. But the people who walked upon it could not help but wonder how long before the soil beneath their feet would be asked again to drink blood. The cities of Spain woke slowly beneath skies heavy with smoke, though no bombs had fallen yet. Morning came with shutters half closed and streets swept clean of yesterday's arguments. In Madrid, a woman walked alone to market beneath posters peeling from the stone walls, the slogans blurred with rain, with sun, with time. Promises of bread, of justice, of dignity faded like ink left too long in light. Across town, men leaned against doorways, their conversations stitched together from doubt and memory. They remembered a Spain where kings ruled without mercy. They remembered a Spain where revolutions bled out in the gutters. They watched the soldiers now moving in quiet lines. Not yet enemies, not yet brothers. Somewhere between. In the cafes, people spoke more softly. In the parks, children played, but even their laughter sounded cautious. Smoke drifted from the factories in thin, uncertain threads. Hunger walked slowly here. It did not arrive all at once. It came in missing wages, in spoiled bread, in small shops closing with no notice. Spain was learning how easily a country unravels, not with thunder, not with fire, but with silence, with patience, with 1,000 small failures. Beyond the cities, in fields where crops withered beneath skies too wide and dry, farmers counted days between rain, their bodies bent from labor, their faces marked by sun and waiting. They listened to the news on radios wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Some heard hope in the speeches of Madrid. Some heard betrayal. All heard fear beneath the words. In the villages, priests still rang bells for mass, but their sermons spoke less of heaven and more of loyalty. Men gathered in squares to argue beneath statues worn smooth by time. Women passed by with baskets and did not stop to listen. They had heard these arguments before. Republic, church, land, bread. Words passed from father to son, from brother to brother, words that settled into soil like seeds. Seeds that would grow into something too tangled to control. At night, fires burned behind shuttered windows. Maps were spread across tables. Names were whispered, crossed out, remembered. In kitchens, in barns, in back rooms of failing shops, Spain divided itself again and again, not by borders, but by silence, by suspicion, by the weight of old wounds reopened. In Madrid, policemen walked with rifles held loose at their sides. Not yet enemies, not yet executioners, but fear sharpened their eyes. Students marched by day, filling streets with banners and songs no one believed would change anything. By night, meetings were held in secret, in cellars, in attics, in rooms lined with books too dangerous to display openly. The newspapers called them agitators, rebels, enemies of Spain, but they called themselves something else. Brothers, sisters, patriots, dreamers. The words mattered less than the hunger beneath them. Hunger for change, hunger for dignity, Hunger for something beyond this slow, suffocating decay. Across the city, windows lit briefly in the dark as men returned home from bars where politics floated in beer like ash, where friends became strangers over the shape of a flag, the name of a general, the meaning of freedom. Arguments burned hot, fast, then faded beneath the weight of mourning. But they left marks on friendships, on marriages, on futures. Spain was learning how even words could draw blood. Elsewhere, the countryside waited as it had always waited. Through wars, through plagues, through monarchs rising and falling like tides. The land knew patience, knew endurance. Beneath the soil lay bones of Romans, of Visigoths, of Moors, of those who had fought for crowns now rusted beyond recognition. Spain had been fought over before. It would be fought over again. In villages where doors hung crooked and wells dried early, people remembered. They remembered hunger. They remembered soldiers. They remembered how fast hope could turn to ash. News travelled slowly here, by rumour, by letter, by the nervous flicker of a priest's candle. The young left when they could. The old stayed because there was nowhere else to go. Fields were ploughed, seeds planted, prayers said. But beneath every gesture lay the knowledge that something was coming. Not a storm, something quieter, something worse. A breaking not of earth, but of people. Families divided not by fences, but by belief, by fear, by the terrible certainty that soon, very soon, the past would come calling again, and this time it would not leave anyone untouched. It began not with cannons, but with footsteps. Footsteps in narrow streets, footsteps on cobblestones, footsteps beneath banners lifted by tired hands. Spain awoke one day and realized it had crossed a line it could no longer see. Brothers became soldiers. Friends became enemies. Uniforms appeared where none had been before. Guns arrived wrapped in cloth, passed from hand to trembling hand. The first shots did not ring out like thunder. They sounded like accidents, like something small, breaking in the distance. But people listened. They listened with their hearts held still in their chests. They listened because they already knew what was coming. In Madrid, men kissed their children goodbye without knowing if they would return. In Barcelona, workers sharpened tools that would soon trade purpose for violence. The government spoke in words too big to hold: revolution, fascism, republic, treason. But on the streets, the words were smaller: bread, family, fear. The sky hung low with smoke from factories already choosing sides. Walls filled with slogans painted in red, in black, in blue. Orders were given, but they carried no peace. Only certainty that soon the streets would no longer belong to those who had once called them home. Cities learned to burn before they learned to fight. Barricades rose where markets had stood. Windows shattered beneath the weight of words shouted too loud. Men dragged chairs, carts, stones into streets to build defenses against neighbors they had once invited to weddings, to baptisms, to quiet meals beneath fading portraits. Fire followed. Fire always follows. Churches burned beneath skies that seemed too tired to rain. Statues crumbled. Books burned. Silence fell heavier than ash. In the countryside, word came slowly. There had been shootings in Seville, arrests in Zaragoza. In Madrid, bodies left unclaimed beneath street lamps. The radio spoke of order, of discipline, of loyalty, but the people heard only fear. Fear wrapped in speeches. Fear dressed as duty. Soldiers marched beneath flags stitched with history's grief. They marched toward cities they did not know, toward men they did not yet hate. Hate would come later. It always does. For now, there was only the weight of a rifle, the pull of a trigger, the silence between breaths. Across Spain, people waited for orders that made no sense, for sides to choose themselves, for the world to decide who would live and who would be left behind. In factories, workers formed militias with guns older than their fathers. In villages, men carried knives hidden in bread baskets. watched roads for strangers, spoke in whispers that tasted of fear. Women sewed bandages beneath lamps, dim to hide their trembling hands. Boys too young to shave pressed uniforms smooth against chests, too thin to carry such weight. The country fractured not along lines of geography, but lines of belief, of fear, of memory. Some fought for God, some for land, some for futures they did not understand but could not bear to lose. The first battles were not battles at all, but skirmishes. Clumsy, brutal, unplanned. Yet blood still stained the soil. Blood does not wait for clarity. It spills when called. When summoned by fear, by anger, by orders written in rooms too far from the screams they cause. In the hills, the trees watched with indifference. They had seen wars before. They would see them again. Beneath their branches, men buried rifles beneath stones, mapped escape routes in dust, prayed without speaking. Across the borders, the world watched but did not move. France closed its eyes. Britain held its breath. Germany and Italy sent guns wrapped as gifts. Russia sent hope disguised as strategy. Spain stood alone, torn between promises and betrayals older than any living memory. The people learned quickly how easily trust turns sour, how fast a handshake becomes a fist. Civilians became soldiers beneath flags they had not chosen. Towns changed hands overnight, names painted over in colors of victory, then painted again days later in the colors of retreat. Food grew scarce, water turned bitter, nights stretched long with gunfire, with footsteps, with cries carried too far on the wind. Spain bled slowly into the earth, into rivers, into prayers said beneath stars indifferent to borders or cause. And through it all, silence grew heavier, pressing down on hearts too weary to hope, too afraid to stop. Power does not arrive with ceremony. It moves quietly, at first. It moves beneath uniforms pressed too sharp, beneath medals polished until they forget what they were earned for. In Spain, generals rose not from battles, but from waiting. Waiting for weakness, for silence, for fear to widen the cracks already splitting through cities and homes. They spoke in iron tones, in words meant to carve rather than heal. Orders were given with no promise but this: obey or vanish. Maps stretched across tables in rooms where curtains remained drawn. Lines drawn and redrawn across fields where crops withered beneath skies too wide to offer rain. Soldiers moved with slow precision, carrying rifles like burdens too familiar to question. Not all believed, not all agreed, but belief had grown dangerous, doubt more dangerous still. The country divided itself beneath these boots, beneath these flags, beneath these men who believed history would remember them kindly. Civilians watched from shuttered windows. They watched roads fill with uniforms, watched neighbors disappear behind closed doors, watched fear wear the face of authority. Across fields and rivers, across hills heavy with silence, borders shifted without warning. Not the borders marked by treaties, but the invisible ones drawn by fear, by allegiance, by suspicion. A village belonged to one side at dawn, to another by dusk. Families packed what they could carry: bread, a photograph, a blanket. Names burned from papers, flags hidden beneath floorboards. To choose wrong was to vanish. To speak wrong was to bleed. Exile began slowly, not all at once. A teacher dismissed, a priest replaced, a mayor arrested beneath the cover of night. Some walked willingly into exile, believing the world beyond Spain would offer safety. Others were carried there by force. Across the Pyrenees, across seas that swallowed ships without regret, they went with nothing but memory. Memory of fields left fallow, of streets once filled with music, of homes that would no longer speak their names aloud. Exile is not a place. It is a wound that never learns how to heal. In cities still untouched by battle, life continued in mimicry. Cafes opened, though fewer came. Schools taught lessons no one believed. Churches rang bells into streets emptied of faith. Fear moved slowly here, dressed as law, as order, as protection. Newspapers printed lies dressed as truth. Truths dressed as lies. People learned to read between lines, to listen between words, to trust nothing said too loudly. Resistance formed in whispers, in pamphlets folded beneath coats, in radios hidden beneath floorboards, in meetings held in cellars lit by a single trembling flame. Orders came from Madrid, from Burgos, from places where men sat safe while others bled. Orders to arrest, to silence, to execute. Spain became a country where tomorrow could not be trusted, where today survived only if yesterday remained unspoken. And still, beneath it all, life persisted. Women drew water from wells. Children played beneath balconies painted in the colours of fear. Old men smoked in courtyards and remembered wars fought long ago. Wars that taught them nothing stays conquered forever. Night fell where morning once lived. Cities darkened not by curfews alone, but by something deeper, something older. The dark returned to Spain like an old friend, familiar in its cruelty, generous in its silence. Streets emptied, doors locked, voices lowered. The sky above watched with stars too distant to intervene. Beneath this sky, the land waited. Fields remembered footsteps, remembered blood. Rivers remembered bodies carried without name. Mountains remembered screams swallowed by wind. Spain was not new to this. Spain had learned long ago how easily power forgets the cost of its hunger. But each time, the forgetting came slower. Each time, the scars lingered longer. Each time, the soil took longer to forgive. Power marched onward. Flags rose, guns fired, orders repeated, lives unraveled. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath the noise, beneath the grief, a question remained unanswered, carried in hearts too weary to ask aloud. How long can a country bleed before it forgets how to heal? Foreign hands found their way into Spain as easily as smoke finds its way beneath a door. They came not with kindness, but with promises wrapped in iron, in oil, in gold. Germany sent planes that painted shadows over villages too small to defend themselves. Italy sent men who marched as though Spain belonged to them already. Russia sent rifles, sent tanks, sent a different kind of fear dressed in the language of salvation. England sent silence. France sent hesitation. America sent nothing at all. Spain became not a country, but a chessboard. Each piece moved by hands far away, each sacrifice calculated by men who would never set foot on the soil they claimed to protect or destroy. The land burned quietly at first. Fields flattened beneath boots, houses crumbled beneath shells, but still people stayed. Still, they believed in something beyond survival. In Madrid, in Barcelona, in the hills where olive trees leaned towards silence, people fought not for politics, but for dignity, for the simple right to wake beneath the sky and call themselves alive without shame. Bombs fell like new seasons, arriving without invitation, without mercy. The sky remembered everything. Planes traced patterns over cities that had not asked to become battlegrounds. Shadows stretched across streets where children once played. Fire fell in sheets too fast to run from. Guernica burned beneath these foreign hands, beneath these foreign machines. Its houses crumbled, its people broke, its name became a wound spoken across continents, though few would remember it beyond photographs, beyond paintings hung in galleries far from where the bodies lay. The world watched and sent words. Condemnation dressed as sympathy, sorrow dressed as speeches. Spain learned quickly that pity brings no bread, that outrage offers no shelter. Beneath the ash, survivors gathered pieces of lives too shattered to mend. They lifted bodies from rubble, buried them beneath soil still warm from fire. They carried grief not as burden, but as breath. Cities learned to live with ruin, walls rebuilt, windows patched, streets renamed, but nothing returned. Not truly, not ever. The sky kept its silence. The earth kept its dead. Letters travelled slower now, if they travelled at all. Soldiers wrote with hands that shook, words that blurred beneath tears held back for months. They wrote to mothers, to wives, to children too young to understand why fathers vanished beneath uniforms that smelled of mud and smoke. Some letters arrived too late. Some never arrived at all. In kitchens, women folded these papers with care, placed them beneath photographs, beneath candles burned low. In rooms where clocks stopped ticking, grief grew roots. It spread through walls, through floorboards, through hearts already thin from waiting. Far from home, men died with names unspoken, buried in soil that would never carry their blood as kin. Cemeteries filled with crosses without markers, without prayers. Some graves were dug in haste. Some never dug at all. Memory frayed beneath this weight. Not all names could be kept alive. Not all faces could be carried forward. In the end, even love learned to forget in order to survive. And so the war continued, stitched together by foreign hands, by guns traded in shadows, by men who spoke of freedom while tightening chains. Spain burned, but it burned differently in each corner. In the north, cities fell beneath shells. In the south, villages emptied beneath threats too quiet to name. In the east, the sea swallowed ships fleeing futures too dark to imagine. And in the west, mountains held their breath, waited for blood to cool, for bodies to vanish into earth's cold patience. Across it all, the people remained. Not as soldiers, not as traitors, as something smaller, quieter, harder to kill, as hands still sewing, as mouths still singing lullabies, as feet still walking roads littered with ruin. Spain endured because it had no other choice. And beneath the rubble, beneath the hunger, beneath the guns that never slept, something softer waited. Something older than flags. Something slower than war. The small, stubborn hope that one day the world might remember how to listen. The war at home was not marked by banners or guns, but by silences that thickened like smoke in closed rooms. Mothers counted not victories, but absences. Absences at the table. Absences in the letters that stopped arriving. Absences in the beds left untouched. In the clothes folded carefully and put away as if waiting might bring them back. In kitchens across Spain, women learned to live alongside hunger as if it were another member of the family. Bread stretched thin. Water carried farther than it should. Lines grew long beneath bakeries that opened less often. Rumors arrived quicker than food. A neighbor taken, a brother shot, a friend vanished without explanation. News came not from radios but from whispers passed carefully, guardedly, mouth to ear like confessions too dangerous to keep inside. Fear wrapped itself around each home, soft but absolute, teaching people how to speak less, how to listen more carefully for the wrong kind of knock at the door. Small crimes became survival. A loaf of bread stolen, a chicken hidden from the requisitioners, a false name given at a checkpoint, quiet betrayals unfolded behind, curtains drawn tight, a cousin reported for hiding pamphlets, a brother arrested for saying too much too loudly. These were not crimes born of cruelty, but of exhaustion, of desperation, of the terrible knowing that war makes cowards of some, heroes of others, and ruins them both without distinction. Trust shrank until it fit in the space between two people sharing a single secret. In the streets, uniforms patrolled with rifles carried not as protection, but as warnings. At night, lists were written, names marked, doors knocked upon, men taken in silence, leaving only the echo of footsteps behind. Some returned, most did not. Those left behind learned to speak in half sentences, to pray beneath their breath, to hope that tomorrow would not call their name. Fear grew like vineyards beneath a sun too indifferent to care. In villages where the church bells still rang, people gathered because gathering meant survival, meant sharing grief in small doses that did not overwhelm. Priests spoke sermons that circled faith, without touching upon the blood spilled outside their doors. Children played in streets lined with banners that changed as often as the winds shifted. Fathers drank more, mothers wept less, even grief became rationed. Even mourning learned to wait its turn. Men wrote diaries with pages torn free before dawn. Women kept journals and codes only they understood. Memory became dangerous, the past became heavier than the future, and yet life continued. Fields were ploughed, seeds planted, births recorded quietly in books hidden beneath floorboards. Hope flickered where it could. In songs hummed softly, in flowers placed where bullets had fallen, in the stubborn refusal to forget what kindness looked like, even as kindness itself became harder to find. Daughters waited by windows for fathers who would not return, for brothers already buried in soil without markers, for lovers lost to front lines that moved too quickly, too carelessly. Waiting became a skill, a ritual, a form of worship. They stitched linens no one would use, cooked meals no one would eat, wrote letters no one would read. Across Spain, behind doors painted in colours fading beneath war's breath, women held the country together with hands calloused by grief, by work, by hope, pressed thinner each day. The war at home did not end in gunfire. It ended in empty rooms, in shoes placed carefully by doors, in photographs kept beneath pillows, in hearts that learned to beat more quietly, more carefully, more slowly. Spain did not break all at once. It frayed, thread by thread, memory by memory, until even the survivors could not recall what peace had sounded like, what silence had meant before it became something heavy enough to drown beneath. There are places where battles never reach, but the silence they leave behind settles just the same. Trenches without names dug into soil too tired to protest, filled with men who stared at the sky as if waiting for answers it would never give. Some days there was no fighting, only waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for rations, waiting for news from home that would not come. In these stretches of quiet, soldiers learned the slow cruelty of time. Days measured not by clocks but by hunger, by the weight of rifles held too long, by the ache of bodies pressed against earth grown colder with each passing night. They wrote letters in the dark, words scratched onto paper thin as breath. Letters to mothers, to sweethearts, to wives whose faces blurred beneath the smoke of days without end. Letters written not to be sent but to remind themselves they still existed, that somewhere beyond the mud and fear, someone might remember their name when this was finished, if it ever finished at all. Smoke rose where villages used to be, curling lazy as lullabies into skies already bruised with forgetting. Houses stood with their insides turned out, walls torn open like wounds, fields flattened beneath tanks left rusting in place, churches with steeples cracked but still reaching, as if faith might hold even here. Crows gathered in trees, stripped bare of leaves, waiting, always waiting. In these silences between battles, the land held its breath. Roads stretched empty beneath suns too bright to soften anything. Graves dug shallow, marked only by stones or by nothing at all. Survivors moved through these places like ghosts, gathering what could be carried, leaving behind what could not. A chair, a dollar, a photograph torn down the middle. Some stayed because leaving meant surrendering more than land. Some left because staying meant death. In either choice, there was no victory. Only endurance measured in footsteps too slow to outrun memory. Children learned to forget because remembering hurt too much. They learned not to ask where fathers had gone, why mothers cried when the radios played certain songs. They learned not to speak the names written on walls or whispered by neighbors behind closed doors. Games became quieter, songs shorter, dreams smaller. In schools, if they remained open, lessons were given by teachers who spoke as if through water, their words heavy with caution, their eyes watching doors more than students. the future narrowed into something shapeless, something carried not in hope, but in habit. You woke. You worked. You waited. At night, stories were told in pieces, fragments of a past already being rewritten. Heroes changed with each passing month. Flags changed. Even names changed. Spoken less often, less confidently. Memory thinned beneath the weight of fear. Childhood passed like smoke beneath doors that no longer opened to laughter. Silence settled in bones still growing, teaching them how to carry grief before they knew the word for it. Soldiers wrote to ghosts because the living had grown too far away. Letters addressed to friends already gone, to brothers lost in mud and smoke, to fathers whose faces no longer came clear in dreams. They wrote to the men they used to be, to the boys who had believed in banners and speeches, who had marched thinking courage was enough. They wrote apologies, confessions, prayers. They folded these pages into pockets alongside photographs worn thin at the edges, carried them into battles that might never come, burned them when the silence grew too loud to bear. In this war without end, between battles too far apart to count, silence became a kind of enemy. It hollowed hearts. It thinned blood. It taught men how to vanish without dying. Across Spain, beneath skies unchanged by grief or hope, this silence pressed down, on trenches, on villages, on children and mothers and soldiers alike. Pressed down until even breath sounded like surrender. Alliances in Spain faded the way fog does. Slowly, without sound, without anyone noticing the moment they were gone. Promises made in ink turned brittle under pressure. Friends became strangers over small decisions, over words spoken carelessly, over fears no one could name aloud. In the beginning, there had been unity, or something that looked like it. Soldiers marching shoulder to shoulder beneath banners held high, workers raising fists in cities already burning, farmers giving bread to strangers because hunger was a language older than sides. But as the months dragged on, something in the air shifted. Trust frayed, loyalty cracked, orders changed without warning, maps redrawn with cruelty disguised as strategy. Those who had stood together began to look over their shoulders, wondering how long before their names too would appear on some list, on some whispered accusation. Spain became a country of shifting shadows. Lines blurred, borders vanished. The cause, whatever it had once been, broke apart beneath the weight of suspicion. And beneath it all, the people kept moving forward, one step at a time. Because stopping meant falling, and falling meant forgetting how to stand again. The dead went unburied because there was no time, no wood, no priest left brave enough to speak the words. Fields held bones beneath thin layers of soil, beneath stones piled by hands too weary for graves. Rivers carried bodies without ceremony. Mountains hid them beneath snow. The earth learned to carry this weight in silence. Families marked places with scraps of cloth, with flowers that wilted beneath skies indifferent to grief. Names were whispered, but not written. Stories told only in secret, passed down like forbidden songs. In some villages, no one spoke at all. Houses emptied, doors hung open, dogs wandered, roads once filled with laughter. Survivors left what could not be carried. Furniture, photographs, the bones of those they had loved too much to abandon, but not enough to die beside. Spain learned to live with ghosts because ghosts did not ask for loyalty. They did not betray. They did not forget. Hope wore a stranger's face, arrived in uniforms sewn in other languages, carried rifles stamped with marks not made in Spain. Foreign voices gave orders. Foreign flags flew above cities too broken to protest. Some welcomed them as saviors, others spat at their feet, but in the end, all bowed beneath the weight of guns, of hunger, of fear dressed in new colors. Promises came wrapped in speeches, in treaties signed behind doors thick enough to muffle doubt. Peace was promised, though no one believed it. Not truly, not anymore. The people listened because listening was safer than refusing. Because hope, even hollow, is lighter to carry than despair. But in the alleys, in the fields, in rooms where radios whispered forbidden news, they waited. Waited for the moment when this, too, would unravel. When allies would become occupiers. When tomorrow would arrive wearing yesterday's wounds, dressed as victory. Spain watched the world make plans and learned once again how little the world understood what it meant to bleed. The roads no longer led home. They led to exile, to camps strung with wire beneath skies too wide to hide beneath, to ships bound for shores where no one waited with open arms, to borders that closed like jaws around the desperate, the wounded, the lost, those who could fled, those who could not remained. Behind them, villages fell silent, cities emptied of anyone young enough to run. The old stayed behind, watching windows for faces that would never return. Houses filled with dust and photographs and memories too heavy to lift. Letters sent without hope of reply. Names carved into stone beneath fields that would not forget, though no one came to tend them. Across Spain, footsteps faded. Roads stretched empty beneath moons too cold to care. And still, somewhere beneath it all, breath remained. Not hope, not faith, only breath. The quiet, stubborn insistence of life beneath ruin, beneath exile, beneath betrayal. The last thing war cannot take. Victories came slowly, like footsteps in deep snow. Not loud, not quick, sometimes not even clear. A town retaken, a road secured, a hill held longer than anyone thought possible. Small things, fragile things, but enough to shift the weight of silence. Enough to remind men that even losing cannot last forever. On the maps drawn in rooms far from the front, arrows moved. Red and black, inching across landscapes too scarred to recognize from above. Reports written in careful language. Strategic advantage, operational success, territory reclaimed. But in the fields where these victories lived, the words were simpler. We held. We survived. We are still here. Soldiers no longer believed in glory. They believed in endurance, in outlasting hunger, cold, grief, in waiting for a dawn that did not bring death. Victories measured in footsteps, in nights without gunfire, in letters from home that arrived unopened. Across Spain, the tide shifted, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. The cities changed again. Walls painted over with the new colors. Statues pulled down and raised again in different shapes, different uniforms. Flags replaced like curtains in a house too tired to protest. Streets renamed, laws rewritten, voices silenced, others raised in chorus, forced or willing. Celebrations staged beneath banners heavy with words no one trusted anymore. Soldiers paraded not with pride but with relief. Prisoners marched beneath signs declaring victory, though their faces held only exhaustion. In homes where radios spoke of triumph, mothers wept over sons who would not return to see it. In churches where bells rang for peace, prayers hung unanswered beneath ceilings blackened by fire. Across Spain, people learned once more how to adjust their faces to survive, to nod when required, to look away when necessary, to carry grief quietly, folded small beneath the heart. The war moved forward, but its shadow remained behind in every empty chair, in every door left closed. In the countryside, seasons returned but brought no comfort. Fields replanted, harvests gathered, but the land felt different beneath the plough, quieter, older, heavy with what it had seen. Farmers worked because there was nothing else to do. Work does not ask questions. It does not mourn. It simply waits for hands to return. Villages emptied of young men. Women aged too quickly beneath the weight of days stretched thin by hunger, by fear, by the ache of hope too long denied. Children played in ruins without understanding the stories buried beneath their feet. Across hills once marched over by soldiers, birds returned. Trees grew. Rivers forgot the blood carried through their depths. Nature forgives because it must. People forgive because they have no choice. Spain rebuilt not from victory, but from necessity. Bricks laid, roads repaired, crops sown, not for pride, not for faith, simply because hunger waits for no politics, because grief cannot feed a family, because even ashes can be swept away. Somewhere beneath all this, beneath speeches and parades and reports sent abroad, the war ended. Not with fanfare, not with peace truly earned. It ended because exhaustion overtakes anger, because bodies fail before hatred does, because silence grows heavier than bullets. In homes where curtains remained drawn, people opened windows again. In streets where tanks once rolled, bicycles returned. In hearts where fear once lived, emptiness settled. Across Spain, the future arrived without invitation, without promise. It simply came, quietly, reluctantly, step by step, not as salvation, not as punishment, as something inevitable, as time continuing because time does not stop for ruins or sorrow. In fields where nothing grew for years, flowers returned. In churches where prayers had died, candles burned again. In homes where silence lived too long, voices rose carefully, cautiously, speaking names aloud once more. Across Spain, breath returned. Slowly, softly, like footsteps in deep snow. Like forgiveness, like the first light after too long in darkness. The end of the war did not bring peace. It brought something quieter, something smaller, a slow unraveling of hopes, too fragile to survive the weight of years. Defeat did not come all at once. It came in mornings where newspapers no longer printed the names of the missing. It came in nights where no one dared to speak of what had been lost. It came in the faces of those who returned to villages emptied of fathers, of brothers, of friends who had shared bread and laughter beneath skies now indifferent to grief. Across Spain, people learned how to live again, but not how to forget. Shops reopened. Schools taught lessons rewritten to fit the new silence. Churches filled with prayers shaped not by faith, but by fear. Streets filled with footsteps, but not with joy. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The victors wrote their version of the story, and those who had lost learned to nod and smile, and keep their sorrow folded small beneath their breath. The war ended, but defeat settled deeper than wounds, deeper than memory. It settled where no banners could reach. Women carried this weight in quiet ways, in rooms where curtains remained drawn, in kitchens where bread stretched thin, where water boiled longer to make it seem like soup, in hands that stitched fabric into uniforms for sons too young to understand the price already paid for the colours they wore. They carried photographs in pockets, letters hidden beneath floorboards, prayers said in rooms no longer safe for honesty. They learned to speak without saying what they meant. They learned to listen for what was not said. They learned to survive by pretending survival had been a choice. Across Spain, mothers grew old without answers. Wives grew silent without anger. Daughters learned how to mourn without tears. The streets belonged to soldiers, to police, to banners hung high above plazas too wide to hide beneath. The homes belonged to ghosts, to memories kept alive in secret, to hope worn thin as cloth washed too many times in water too cold to cleanse. Men returned from exile or from prison or from hiding with faces marked not by wounds, but by time. They found streets changed, houses abandoned, names no longer spoken aloud. They found children grown and wives older and fathers gone. They found jobs given to others, places taken by those who had been brave enough to choose survival over loyalty. They learned to walk past neighbors without recognition, to nod at those who had betrayed them, to keep their heads low and their voices lower still. They learned how to lose again and again, in small ways, in wages withheld, in friendships vanished, in glances that slid away like shadows, They gathered in bars where no one asked questions, where no one spoke of before. They drank to forget, or to remember, or simply because it filled the space where grief might otherwise grow too loud. Across Spain, men counted defeats not in battles, but in days survived without dignity, without pride, without hope that tomorrow might offer anything softer than this. And yet, life continued. It always does. Children grew tall beneath skies, cleared of smoke but not of sorrow. Fields turned green again. Crops grew, rivers ran. Birds returned to sing songs without knowing who had died beneath the trees they perched upon. Spain moved forward because time allowed no other choice. Weddings happened. Births followed. Laughter returned, cautious and thin but real enough to carry through open windows. Music played in streets where tanks had once rolled. Flags waved. Not all hearts beat willingly beneath them, but they beat. And that was enough. Enough to call this peace. Enough to call this an ending. Even if it was not. Even if beneath the surface, beneath the soil, beneath the breath held tight in every chest, the war still smoldered. Silent now. Patient. Waiting. For memory to soften. For wounds to fade. For time to wear away even this grief until nothing remained but stories half remembered, names half spoken, love half believed in. Across Spain, life returned. Not whole, not healed, but returned all the same. The last pushes were not triumphant. They were tired. Exhausted by years of fighting, by months without rest, by promises broken too many times to count. Soldiers moved through muddy fields, through towns scarred by shellfire, their faces drawn tight with weariness more than fear. The air smelled of rain and gunpowder, but the thunder of battle had become a distant memory, replaced by the steady, grinding rhythm of advance and retreat, of hope and despair tangled beyond distinction. Generals gave orders with voices too hoarse to command. Men obeyed because there was no other choice. Families waited in homes shuttered against the cold, listening for the sound of footsteps that might never come. Cities held their breath beneath skies heavy with smoke and silence. Each day ended with fewer fires, fewer guns, but no one dared to believe the war was truly ending. Not yet. Not while so much remained broken. Across the lines, the faces of soldiers mirrored one another, young men made old by grief, by hunger, by the slow loss of dreams. Their eyes carried stories they could no longer tell aloud. Stories of friends lost in the mud, of letters that never arrived, of hopes extinguished before they could catch flame. They marched because the world watched, because the world expected it, because the ground beneath their feet no longer held anything but memory and loss. Each step forward was a step away from everything familiar, from everything that had once meant home. The war was no longer about ideals or flags. It was about survival, about making it through one more day without forgetting who they had been before this all began. In towns taken and retaken, people waited behind doors, watched from windows, held children close and prayed that this final chapter would bring something gentler than the ones before. Yet the battles continued, fought not with fury, but with exhaustion. Artillery fired with less precision, planes flew lower and slower, and the silence between gunfire grew, longer. The land was scarred beyond healing. Fields churned to mud, rivers clogged with debris, roads cracked beneath tanks too heavy to move further. Soldiers caught brief moments of peace in stolen glances, in shared cigarettes, in quiet songs hummed beneath the stars. They clung to these fragments of humanity because the war had stripped everything else away. In these moments, the world seemed to hold its breath with them. The air tasted of rain and regret. The sky held the promise of dawn that might never come. And beneath it all, the war dragged on, a shadow too vast to outrun, too deep to forget. As resolve faded, so did hope. The promises made by leaders turned to dust in the mouths of those who had to believe them. The world outside Spain seemed distant, indifferent, Aid slowed. Alliances shifted. The lines on maps became meaningless as soldiers fought less for victory and more for the chance to see another sunrise. Some surrendered quietly. Others fought until the last breath, not for cause, but because to stop was unthinkable. The war's end was not a moment, but a slow unraveling, a fading light in a sky too dark for comfort. Across the country, families counted losses in silence, buried grief in gardens, and waited for the day when the guns would finally rest. And when they did, when the war was over in name if not in memory, Spain was left to reckon with what remained, broken, battered, and waiting for a peace that would not come easy. The war's end was not a release but a heavy silence, like a breath held too long beneath water. Cities lay shattered, their bones exposed beneath skies that had forgotten how to weep. Streets, once alive with laughter, were now filled with echoes of footsteps that would never return, of voices silenced before their stories could be told. Families gathered what remained of their lives in hands too small to carry so much loss. Walls crumbled around photographs faded by time and tears. Children who had known only conflict stared at empty horizons, learning what it meant to grow up without a past, without a future. Spain was broken, yes, but not beyond the slow work of healing. Yet healing would be a road without end, marked by memories too sharp to forget, and scars too deep to hide. The cost was counted not just in bodies, but in trust lost, in communities fractured beyond repair. Neighbors once bound by shared meals and stories now looked upon one another with suspicion, with grief folded tight beneath their gazes. The wounds of betrayal were quiet, but no less deep. Names whispered in fear, friendships severed in silence, love strained by absence and unspoken pain. Prisoners returned to towns where their homes were gone, or worse, occupied by strangers who had made themselves comfortable in the ruins. Forgiveness was a distant word, one spoken only in dreams or in the pages of books too fragile to hold the weight of truth. Spain's people learned to carry the burden of consequence in ways that history could not capture. Small acts of kindness amidst ruin. Quiet moments of remembrance beneath skies too heavy to hold them all. Politicians rose on promises that echoed empty in the cold light of day. Governments formed and fell as quickly as the seasons changed, each one struggling to grasp control of a land still trembling beneath the weight of war's shadow. Laws were rewritten again, as if paper could hold the shifting tides of pain and power. Many turned away, looking beyond Spain's borders to futures untouched by this history of fire. Others stayed, stubborn in their refusal to let silence swallow everything. In classrooms, children learned lessons that spoke of peace but carried the ghost of violence between the lines. In homes, old songs were sung quietly, fading as memories did, reminders of a time before everything fractured. Spain became a country rebuilt not just from stone and steel, but from the fragile threads of hope that refused to break, even when the world had turned its back. The consequences stretched beyond the battlefield into every heart and every street. The war had changed what it meant to be Spanish, what it meant to live, to love, to remember. It taught lessons in loss and endurance, in betrayal and survival, in silence and speech. It left behind a country where every shadow carried a story, where every stone had seen more than its share of sorrow. Yet beneath this heavy weight, something endured, a stubborn pulse of life that refused to stop. People planted gardens where bombs had fallen, gathered in quiet squares beneath skies that slowly learned to shine again. They whispered names to keep memory alive, to honor those who could not speak for themselves. Spain's story was one of collapse, yes, but also of consequence. And in consequence, the seeds of a future still waiting to grow. Memory is a fragile thing. It bends beneath the weight of time, folds quietly beneath the passing years, and sometimes slips away when least expected. Spain learned this painfully. Those who survived the war carried memories like hidden wounds, silent and unseen yet never fully healed. Families passed down stories, sometimes whispered beneath breath, sometimes shouted behind closed doors. But memory was not simple. It was tangled with grief, with anger, with regret. Some wanted to remember so fiercely that they risked reopening old wounds. Others wished only to forget, to bury the past beneath layers of silence so thick that even hope could not breathe through. The price of memory was high. It asked for more than 10 stories. It demanded truth, forgiveness, and the courage to face the shadows that lived in every corner of the heart and country. Monuments rose, tall and cold, etched with names that tried to hold the past steady. Cemeteries grew in numbers and in silence, each grave a reminder of lives lost too soon, of futures stolen before they could bloom. Yet memory was not just in stone. Lived in songs sung softly by grandmothers, in photographs worn at the edges from hands that held them too tightly, in letters folded and refolded until the ink faded into shadows. Schools debated how to teach the past, whether to paint it in black and white, or to show the grey shades that no one wished to admit. Memory became a battleground itself, where stories fought for space between the truths that comforted and the truths that burned. The price was the cost of remembering and forgetting at the same time, of holding onto pain without letting it consume the soul. Families fractured under the weight of memory. Children grew into adults carrying the silence of questions never answered, of histories told in fragments, or not at all. Some searched for names lost in the fog of war, travelling to forgotten towns, to fields overgrown with weeds, to archives filled with brittle papers and fading ink. Others turned away, fearful that digging would only stir ghosts better left at rest. The past lived both inside and outside of them, in quiet homes, in crowded streets, in the spaces between conversations where something unspoken lingered. Memory shaped identity, fractured it, rebuilt it piece by piece with hands trembling from generations of pain and hope tangled together. The cost was a kind of living shadow, a reminder that history is never truly behind us, but carried always like a secret too large to keep. Yet, in the quiet places where memory was strongest, something else grew, something fragile but fierce. The will to remember with kindness, to hold the past without being crushed by it, to build a future that honored all who had suffered without repeating the same mistakes. Across Spain, small communities gathered to share stories, to plant trees, to light candles beneath skies that had once been dark with war. Museums opened their doors slowly, inviting questions rather than answers. Schools taught lessons of empathy, of pain, of survival. Memory became not just a burden but a gift, one that asked for care, for courage, for compassion. The price was steep, but it was also the only way to keep the past alive without being consumed by it. To find peace not in forgetting, but in the gentle art of remembering well. What remains after the fire is not always what we expect. Ash settles where fields once bloomed. Silence spreads where songs once filled the air. In Spain, the end of war left behind something quieter than victory or defeat. It left behind questions and spaces where answers would never come. The cities rebuilt themselves slowly, brick by brick, wall by wall. Streets cleaned of rubble, squares repaved, fountains repaired so water could run freely again. Yet beneath the stone, beneath the earth, the war remained. Not in banners or speeches anymore, but in memory, in bloodlines, in the spaces between words shared carefully across kitchen tables. The world outside moved on. Other wars took its attention. Other countries became headlines. But within Spain, people still measured time not by calendars, but by loss. How many years since he disappeared? How many since she never came home? How many since the night no one speaks of? This was the rhythm left behind. Quiet, unfinished. Homes rebuilt themselves in layers. New paint covered old cracks, new photographs placed on mantles beneath older ones, faces smiling over generations that would never meet. Children played in streets once marked by tanks, their laughter lighter than the soil beneath their feet. Parents watched with hearts still carrying shadows. Grandparents sat beneath trees that had survived, telling stories with careful omissions, with soft endings. No one forgot, but few spoke freely. Memory had taught caution. The past remained, but it did not rule. It lingered like smoke in clothes, long after the fire has burned out. In the hills, the scars of trenches faded beneath wildflowers. In the towns, empty chairs remained at tables, untouched but not unloved. What remained was not ruin, not entirely. What remained was survival, was endurance, was breath held and released, over and over, until life became ordinary again. There were those who remembered too well, who carried names in their mouths like prayers. They gathered in quiet corners, lit candles beneath photographs, kept journals no one would ever read. They wrote letters addressed to the past, knowing they would never be answered. They walked roads their brothers had marched, sat beneath windows their mothers had leaned from, traced maps of battles long faded from public memory. They did not seek revenge. They sought understanding. They sought to piece together the shattered glass of history, to fit memory into place before it could be lost to time entirely. They knew that what remains after the fire is fragile. Stories change. Faces blur. Truth becomes harder to hold. But still, they tried. They carried remembrance as a duty, as a promise, as the only inheritance left untouched by war. In their silence, they preserved what mattered. Not dates, not victories, the small things, a song, a name, a love never spoken aloud but never forgotten. And still, Spain breathed. Slowly, carefully. A country stitched together from wounds and wonder, from sorrow and stubbornness. New generations grew tall beneath skies no longer heavy with ash. They asked questions. Some were answered, some were not. They built futures atop fields once marked by loss, not knowing the names buried beneath. Schools taught lessons of peace, of war, of silence. Museums opened with exhibits wrapped in caution, in reverence. Monuments stood beneath sun and rain, steady and unmoved. What remained after the fire was this: a people who knew the weight of grief, who carried it without bitterness, without pride, only with the quiet dignity of those who have survived. The fire ended, but its heat lingered in bones, in breath, in earth. Spain moved forward not with triumph, but with tenderness, with care, with memory folded gently into each day's ordinary beginning, with hope not loud, not bright, but steady, steady enough to last. The end.